Armies don't solve social problems. It isn't the solution, it's a part of the problem. Private military contracting has always happened and will always happen.
What's the going rate for retaking a city?
5 million to do it and 5 million bonus after it's done.
How do you get involved in a coup d'etat of Equatorial Guinea?
I want to know that the dictatorship, the tyranny is horrible. If it turns out the tyrant is not really a tyrant, then I'm not interested. It was awful. People were being sacrificially eaten, street boys were being taken off the street and used for sexual purposes, and so on and so forth. We go to Harare to collect the weapons and ammunition, and we're surrounded by 20 people in black overalls with MP5s. Get down off the truck, you're under arrest, we're in prison. They took me to Black Beach prison, and they started interrogating me, and within 10 days I had malaria. And I thought, I think I must have hit the bottom here. Well, one Saturday, the Attorney General said, well, you're going to get a pardon. An hour later, we were sitting in the hotel having lunch, you know.
And how many years had you been there at that point?
4.
What do you want people to learn from your story?
The real key to leadership is personal honesty, because people will trust the truth. And if you haven't got that within yourself, then it isn't going to get to them either. Just stay true to yourself at all costs.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
They say truth is stranger than fiction, and that was never more the case than when it comes to Simon Mann. He went to school at Eton, one of the top private schools in the UK, went on to become an SAS officer. His father was the captain of the cricket team of Britain. But Simon went the other way and ended up becoming a mercenary and fought in Angola over the oil wells. Then he went to Sierra Leone and fought the rebels over diamond mines. But he wasn't finished, because he was about to partake in a coup d'etat of Equatorial Guinea to basically depose the king, and by doing so, he got locked up in a Zimbabwean prison for 7 years of his life.
Easy.
Later, he was pardoned by the king, and now he's friends with the same man that had him locked up in prison and was going to even kill him at one point. It doesn't get any crazier. I love Simon Mann. He really exemplifies pushing life to the limits and just going for it and getting some. This story might offend you. It might bother you what he did, but it doesn't bother me because I just love this guy and I just love what he did. So sit back for the craziest ride you've ever been on with Simon Mann. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Simon Mann, the British mercenary and former SAS officer who served 7 years in jail for a failed coup d'etat to replace the dictator of Equatorial Guinea in Africa. In the 1990s, your company, Executive Outcomes, provided mercenary services for civil wars and diamond wars in Angola and Sierra Leone. Then, in 2004, during the coup attempt of Equatorial Guinea, you were arrested in Zimbabwe and served 7 years in 2 of Africa's toughest jails, including the infamous Black Beach prison, before later being pardoned. Today, you speak around the world about your experiences and provide expertise on private military contracting and mining. Simon, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure having you here. Your last show has been watched by over 500,000 people. and people were completely divided by your story.
Okay.
So, some people were fascinated, some people were appalled. What do you make of that reaction to you? I'm sure you get that all the time.
Yeah, I do. Most people have a much better opinion of me and impression of me after they've met me. How surprising is that?
Because they think you're this one thing and then they meet you and they realize actually...
Well, I think it's the labeling thing. So mercenary, obviously. Mercenaries have had a pretty bad press over the years.
Yeah. Is it the right word to use? Is it just misunderstood?
I wouldn't say it's misunderstood. I mean, mercenary as a word, you can be a mercenary doctor. If somebody says, oh, that doctor's such a mercenary,
right,
they mean the guy's more worried about making money than he is about being a doctor.
Okay.
Which is fair enough. So a mercenary soldier is, again, it's also like, are Gurkhas mercenaries? Is any professional soldier a mercenary? Or do you have to be, outside of the recognized armed forces of a country in order to be a mercenary? And it's a very pernickety argument after quite a short time.
Yeah, because like you said, you kind of get into the weeds there, because if this guy is being paid for military services or this guy is a Navy SEAL and they're both going in, sometimes they're side by side. Correct. In places like Iraq with people in Blackwater.
Exactly.
What's the difference? Except one guy's being paid 10x.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
So it gets to be a fine line.
Yeah, going back even into like the 70s, when there was the war going on in Oman, it was a sort of secret war that the British were engaged in, trying to support the king of the Sultan, Qaboos of Oman. And I was around at that time, and I didn't actually take part in it, but I could have been in the same firefight by 3 completely different routes. I could have been an SAS officer with, SAS soldiers. I could have been a seconded British officer with Omani troops or Baluchi troops, or I could have been a contract officer. No, same firefight, same job, same everything, except most people would not classify the first 2 as mercenaries, but they would the third, maybe.
Right.
Because I'm a contract officer. But then some people would say, well, yeah, but wait a minute, you weren't really, because you were serving under the crown, so to speak, of Oman. Although you were on a contract, you were in the armed forces of the Oman. So does that make you a mercenary? So then, are the Gurkhas mercenaries? We have Gurkhas in the British Army. Are they mercenaries? Is the Swiss Guard, the Pope in Rome, are they mercenaries? Because originally they were Swiss, famously.
Right.
Swiss mercenaries in the Middle Ages. And so it gets sort of fuzzy. And there is an African convention for the doing away with mercenaries, 1965, where they tried to define mercenaries very, very finely because they were going to hang them. And that's quite interesting reading. I have actually read that. I read that while I was in prison, with a certain amount of interest. It's actually in there, it very clearly states that, you are only a mercenary, if there is a war. You're not a mercenary unless there is a declared war.
Okay.
You're not a mercenary if you're within the armed forces of a country. And you're not a mercenary unless you've actually fought. So you could be a supply pilot,
right,
armed to the teeth, a white guy in a horrible war in the middle of Africa, and you're not a mercenary, according to that convention.
Okay.
So, people have tried to nail it down, but it's like anything, it's difficult.
And we saw, Eric Prince, who had formerly founded Blackwater, he's gone into the logistics business, right?
Well, I know Eric quite well.
Okay.
He is in the logistics business. Absolutely.
Which is probably a very profitable business and just as tricky as maybe security is.
Yeah,
maybe.
And again, the lines become blurred.
Right.
Because if you're doing logistics in a war zone, then, it's exactly what I was just saying about the African Convention against mercenaries. At what point are you actually a mercenary soldier?
Right.
Now, they never actually, the African Convention, the one I'm talking about, all the attending countries passed it. None of them enacted it. And certainly none of them have enforced it, other than South Africa, who introduced the FMA, the Foreign Military Assistance Act, which came in 1998 and was specifically targeted at executive outcomes.
Okay, which was your company.
Yeah, and that was the end of executive outcomes.
Okay, so they
We're
specifically...
very proud of it. It's our own personal piece of legislation.
Well, look, I want to get into executive outcomes and how you made the transition from being in the British military, SAS, into becoming a mercenary for executive outcomes, and then the whole thinking behind that. Before we get into that, I was reminded of a quote, like literally a few minutes ago before we started, by Winston Churchill that says, "We sleep safely at night because rough men stand ready to visit violence on those who would harm us." It's a quote I think a lot of people have heard. And I always think about the person that's willing to go to the supermarket and buy the nice, pretty steak in the cellophane wrapper, but isn't willing to go out and shoot the animal and gut them and kill them. And I'm curious what you think of most people who, when they think of warriors and war and military servants, they point the finger and say, oh, that's bad. And yet they enjoy their peace, their prosperity, which is only because of the military complex. How does that make you feel when you deal with most people?
It doesn't bother me actually at all. I think it's fine that, I don't really want them walking around thinking, oh my God, thank heavens that, these terrible things are going on, if they are going on. I think that's just the way our society has always been. I mean, the example I always use is Jane Austen. And if you read all the Jane Austen books, there's, I think, only a couple of references in the entire library of books that she wrote to the war. But the fact is that England was in an existential war against Napoleon for most of that time. There's no mention in the books. I think that's rather nice that, these things are going on over there and everything's going on calmly here. That's a good way to keep it.
All right, so you think the public should kind of not necessarily know what's going on and leave that to the services and the special forces?
I don't know, it's an interesting difference between the United States and the UK, that.
Where the US is more proactive and...
The US is much more vociferous and much... So, for example, the whole veteran thing, that really is a big deal in the States.
Yeah.
Whereas it's a much lesser deal here.
Yeah, true.
Although that is changing, definitely changing. But it is an interesting cultural difference. So, for example, I mean, the UK with its whole, imperial past, people get buried where they died, or they always were. They didn't come back. Partly, I think, for logistical and
right.
The obvious reasons. Whereas the Americans have always tried to get people back. And I think that shows a different attitude to what's going on.
Yeah.
And similarly, the French, I mean, if you look at the French, I mean, dying in defense of France is fine, but dying in some foreign place for some, not very clear objective is not fine. And hence the Foreign Legion.
Right.
Get some other people to do it for you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Look, I want to get into your story about how you kind of first got introduced to Africa. I know you just came back from Africa, so you're still involved in doing business over there. And I want to hear kind of about this whole story and what it's like to do what you did at Executive Outcomes and why you did it, and so people to understand it. But before, you started off with a background that would never seem to land someone in a prison in Zimbabwe or one in Equatorial Guinea. I mean, you went to Eton.
Yes.
For people that don't know, what is that experience like for people in America? What does it mean to go to Eton? I mean, you're surrounded by people that are probably going to go on to become members of parliament and these types of things.
No, there are a few, but I mean, actually, Eton, certainly when I was there, was incredibly broad brush. You had all sorts of people. And I think you always have had, actually, from what I can gather. It's always difficult because you only know one school. So that was my school, and I thought, well, that's sort of normal.
What was it like?
Oh, I loved it. It was great. I had a really good time.
And how is it different than, say, other schools? I know you didn't go to them, but what makes Eton different?
I think Eton's very cosmopolitan. It's close to London, with all that means. There's no campus. It's open.
Okay.
Obviously, a lot of the parents are wealthy and powerful people, but not all of them. So you've got all of that interaction going on, all that complexity. I remember even my father's story. His great friend, who became the Earl of Inchcape, and his mother used to come down and visit them at Eton in the 30s in an open Rolls Royce, and she was very glamorous, with her black jazz band lover in the Rolls Royce with her. And this was in the 30s, so it was. There's always been a sort of outrageous element going on at Eton. So I mean, I was there from 65 to 70.
Okay.
Which obviously was a time of great social change, uproar, hair, anti-Vietnam War, rock and roll, Rolling Stones, drugs, the whole thing was going on. And very Eton-like, it was going on there too. It wasn't like Eton was this sort of bubble of, it was very much happening there within the school.
But you were a teenager then? Okay.
Yeah. So Eton is like 13 to 18.
Okay.
Those 5 years. Yeah.
And all that kind of craziness was going on because from the outside it looks like everybody's walking around you're walking around in full tails.
Yes.
Every day.
Yes.
You wear the suits with the tails.
Yes.
It's with top hats too? No.
No, they went in the war.
Okay.
Because they needed the silk for parachutes.
Okay. So they took that.
With a great sigh of relief, the top hats disappeared.
Before that, they used to wear top hats to school.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Wow. And yet still there was this counterculture element because it was so cosmopolitan and cutting edge and all
Very
this.
much so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. People taking LSD.
There's all sorts of things going on.
Okay. It was legal back then for a few years.
Yeah, well, that wasn't really my scene, but I mean, it was certainly happening.
Okay. And your father was a famous cricketer.
Yeah.
Did you ever consider going that route?
I was terrible at cricket. I tried very hard, actually, because my father and my grandfather both captained England.
Wow.
So obviously I was destined as the eldest son that I too was going to captain England for cricket. But by the time I got to Eton, it was very clear to me, if nobody else, that I wasn't going to captain anything for cricket. And I really tried, actually, because I thought, well, this was what went on. I mean, Daddy was still working in cricket, so he was the big, the big man. He was eventually chairman of the International Cricket Council and goodness knows what. Anyway, I got to Eton. I'd had enough of cricket. I knew I wasn't any good at it, and I discovered the river, which was much more fun, and so I took up rowing.
Okay.
Because at Eton in those days, you were either a wet bob and you rowed, or you were a dry bob and you played cricket.
Wet bob or dry bob?
Wet bob or dry bob. There were, once you got into the upper realms of the school, you could be something that was called a slack bob, which meant that you merely played golf or tennis or athletics or something, but that was a slack bob.
Okay. Did any of your children go to Eton?
No, none of them.
Because they didn't
Sadly, no. Well, no, actually, I mean, Eton today now is that the standard is just fantastically high, academically.
Right.
And none of them would, I mean, actually, I suppose the two older ones might have done. But by then I was divorced, and I think my first wife, having been married to me and then divorced and then having married another Etonian, thought that she'd had more than enough of the place as it was, and the boys didn't go there.
What does the attitude of an Etonian bring? Like, how would you describe someone?
Well, famously, Kingsley Amis said, who was an Etonian, said of Ian Fleming, who was an Etonian, that in writing James Bond, who was a fictional Etonian, Fleming had achieved the Etonian dream of effortless success. Okay, so when I went down to Eton, I was talking to the boys because they asked me to talk down there, and I told this story. And I said, and of course we all know that success is never effortless. So maybe the Etonian dream is the appearance of effortless success. Even if it's not effortless, it must look effortless if we can do it that way.
And that's what it is.
Well, I don't know. That's just one way of looking at it.
But the champions of Eton make it look effortless.
Well, I don't know if they really do. But I mean, and I think it's like all these things, you can't generalize. But what was immensely privileged about Eton when I was there was that it really did. It was a really broad church. And I mean, if you were gay, if you were an artist, if you were a scientist, if you were an athlete, you could do that. You could be that. And people were. And because it's a big school. I mean, even then it was 1,200 boys. And it was extremely tolerant.
Wow.
And there was no bullying. I mean, I never encountered any real bullying at Eton, which in those days was quite unusual compared with what one heard from other schools.
Yeah.
But what I think it was really good at, and I think it's probably maybe lost that now actually, is that it was very, very good at taking really rough academic material, such as me, and doing the best that could be done with that material. The differential, in other words.
Okay.
Bringing somebody from being really pretty hopeless to being somebody who passed their A-levels.
Okay, and you did.
I did. Well, you had to in those days to get into the army.
And so let's talk about the Army. Is that something you always wanted to do? And what did your father think of that choice?
Well, that again is a slightly strange story because my grandfather and my father both served in the Scots Guards, which became my regiment.
And what is the Scots Guards for people that don't know?
Okay, well, it's one of the regiments of foot guards that are the Queen's own troops,
Right.
their own the household troops.
Okay.
So the foot guards are the Grenadiers, Coldstream, Scots, Irish, Welsh, in that order of seniority. And then you've got the two mounted regiments who are also part of the household, which are the Life Guards and the Blues and Royals.
Okay. And these are kind of elite levels that are...
Well, these are they're the guards. So they were always, they were all at the key battles, the great battles, and guard the Queen. But they're also, regular troops. So
Okay.
they don't just guard the Queen.
Okay. And you became one as well, but your family had a history.
Yeah, so my grandfather was in the Scots Guards the whole way through the First World War. My father was the whole way through the Second World War. Miraculously, both survived. And when I said I wanted to join the Scots Guards, my father took a very dim view. He didn't want me to at all, because he sort of said, well, we're not professional, as a family, we are not professional soldiers. We just joined because of the Germans.
Okay, it was conscription, or they joined?
No, they volunteered.
They volunteered, okay.
Yeah.
But being a professional soldier was not looked well upon.
And they didn't like them. My grandfather and my father, in both world wars, did not like the professional soldiers that they found to tell him what to do.
Okay.
And they took a very dim view of that.
All right.
And then my father said, well, I suppose if you really want to join the army, you can. But I really don't think you should join the Guards in peacetime. Because he had this idea that, all the officers were hooray Henrys and sort of sat around drinking too much.
What's a hooray Henry?
A hooray Henry? A toff, too much money, not enough to do.
Okay.
Something like that.
So it's a class division, the professional soldier, or they're still usually kind of an upper class person?
Well, now we're getting into quite tricky territory. But so in the Guards, traditionally, the officers are, so when I joined the Scots Guards, I think half of the officers' mess were Etonians. Okay. They'd been to Eton.
Okay.
And that had been the case for a long time. It's not so much the case now, but still that way.
All right, so you join anyways, rebellious.
I joined, rebelliously, and by that time I knew I wanted to get into the Special Air Service.
And why was that a
if
goal?
I possibly could.
And
Well, when I was at school, they were engaged in Borneo, in Oman, in Aden, in the Radfan, and all sorts of things were going on that I knew about.
who are the SAS for people that don't know?
That's the Special Air Service, which began in 1941 in the Western Desert by David Stirling, and they were a special regiment of which the objective was to go behind enemy lines and do as much damage as they possibly could to strategic targets, if they could find them.
Kind of one of the very first special forces.
The first of that sort.
Of that sort, of
And,
any major military.
And I mean, Delta in the States is the closest American equivalent. And those two forces today are very, very close. They're very good friends.
Okay. Often on similar deployments, possibly.
And often working together.
Together, okay. And then later the SEALs came, which was kind of the Navy version of Delta.
I don't think actually later, because I think that the United States Marine Corps had the SEALs going way back.
Okay.
Maybe even before the SAS started. But you have many different levels of SEAL as well. And their equivalent in the UK is the SBS, which is the Special Boat Sections.
Okay.
But I mean, they're tiny compared with the American outfits.
Okay. But SAS is this elite force, and you were interested because you wanted to push yourself. It was exciting.
Yeah, it just sounded like it was like the best thing. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to join the army, then that's obviously the place to try and go to. But more importantly, my cousin, Lockie McLean, was in it. And so when I was at school, I knew what they were doing, and I really wanted to emulate him. You know, he was a sort of hero. So
he was doing cool
and
missions.
he went to Eton as well, and I knew him quite well. Obviously, I knew him well. He's a cousin, and so he's now Sir Lachlan McLean, the head of the clan McLean, living up in Mull.
Wow.
In Scotland. Yeah.
And why was he knighted?
No, it's a baronetcy, so it was inherited.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And was it difficult to get into the SAS?
It is difficult, yes.
What does it require?
I think the best way of putting it, which is the way it was put to me when I asked my friend who had been in it, and I said, how do I get in? What's the story? You know, can you give me some tips and a bit of sort of mentoring? And he looked at me and just said, no. He said, if you want to get in, you will. You've just got to want to get in badly enough. But that actually equates to really, really badly.
Okay.
So the selection is such that any kind of, any idea that the reason you wanted to get in was because you think it was romantic or sexy or, you know, it was going to do you a load of good and stuff, that disappears in the course of selection because it is hard.
We've seen, you know, buds at Navy SEAL training, which is their kind of Hell Week scenarios. We've watched that on television. Is there a British equivalent of that for the SAS?
I haven't actually watched that.
Okay.
And there's, there is a bit of sort of what are called sickeners. You know, when they put you through things to sicken you, you know, basically just to sicken you. But the actual selection itself, the test week, you're on your own. And so it's all up here, whether you really want to keep going or not.
You're on your own. What was that? How so? What do they do to you?
Well, you know, obviously you're not entirely on your own because you're moving across the Welsh mountains, the Brecon Beacons, and you're going checkpoint to checkpoint. And your speed has got to be up to a speed. And you don't actually know what that speed is, so you've got to really keep going. And unlike in the army, nobody is saying well done, and nobody is saying badly done. And that's very hard when you come from the army, where everything is being looked after, and you're being shouted at, and get a move on, man, or well done, man. There's nothing like that. It's just you're suddenly in this psychological vacuum of no encouragement, no criticism. Just, okay, where are you now? Your next place is here. Show me on the map. Okay. And that's extremely disorientating. And as you go through the week, your rucksack is getting heavier and heavier, and you're getting more and more tired. And the weather is probably getting worse. And by the end of it, you're thinking, why did I want to do this? And that's the point, At that point, lots of people fail.
Did you watch people quit?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
What was the hardest part of that whole training?
I don't know, it then goes into another phase, which is called continuation. You're still not badged. You don't get your badge till the end. And the jungle phase is hard, because there they're not looking at you in terms of your determination. We've shown that on test week. They're looking at you in terms of your ability to get on with a small group and start to, working together as a team and then achieving things in the jungle.
Okay.
I mean, you're training, but you're under close observation. And as an officer, obviously, you're being looked at in a different way to how the men are being looked at, in the sense that, you've got to not only fit in, but you've also got to be able to command as well. And so that is, then you're getting to subjectivity. So when you're doing the hills in Wales, it's all on the time and the distance. Can you hack it? And then it's subjective. Either you make the times or you don't. The jungle, and there's a thing called Officers' Week, that's subjective. And so you're wondering, you start second guessing yourself. You start thinking, well, what are they looking for? And that's not a good idea.
What jungle were you in?
Belize.
Wow, so they just flew you all down there in jungle training.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that is not a nice jungle.
How so? There's nice jungle and not nice jungle.
Oh yeah, there's very definitely nice and not nice jungle.
What's the difference?
No, Belize is hellish jungle. I mean, you can be down to 100 meters in an hour.
Chopping.
Kilometre a day. No, because you don't chop, in fact. And it's hard, and it's because it's all secondary. Because the Mayan civilization were cattle-based, and they grazed cattle through the jungle, and they cleared a lot of jungle. So, which basically means the light comes down, there isn't a canopy. Because in good jungle, you have there's very little ground cover. The canopy's all up there, and you can walk quite quickly through the jungle, but not in Belize, you can't. And then that also means that you've got feral cattle around, which means parasites, beefworms in the jungle, just waiting for a British soldier, sweating and cursing. They sort of going, oh, yummy, yummy.
Sounds like quite a time. So you make it into the SAS,
Yeah.
And from there, probably maybe the next big thing you do is you're sent to Northern Ireland. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I did my tour as a troop commander in the SAS, and at that time, our operational role was Northern Ireland.
For people that don't remember, what was that like back then? What did it feel like?
Northern Ireland?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, when I did my SAS tour, I think it was my 5th or 6th tour. So I'd already been to Northern Ireland 4 or 5 times, I can't remember exactly how many, with the Scots Guards. So Northern Ireland was not foreign territory at all. So I'd already operated in Northern Ireland, sometimes not in uniform, sometimes covertly, hiding in the bushes, pretending that we're bush. So doing it with the SAS was not that different. It was a level up in terms of the way in which everything was done and the level of intelligence we were operating with and all of that kind of thing. But it wasn't totally foreign territory, not at all.
And your job is to spy on the IRA at that point and try to predict violence.
Yeah, I mean,
stop
what
violence.
we would really like to do is shoot them. Because actually we weren't the intelligence gathering arm anyway, although we did do some of that. We were meant to be the executive force, so either shoot them or arrest them.
Okay.
Preferably with their weapons on them, so that they are sort of guilty, red-handed, so to speak.
Okay.
And that was the whole sort of game, that was the intelligence game, trying to catch them when they had their weapons.
Because that's the problem with urban warfare. You can't tell the difference between a civilian and a soldier.
No, and also the guy can say, unless you've got something on him, he can say, well, what's wrong? What's the matter? Whereas if he's carrying a weapon, then obviously something is the matter.
What do you remember most from those days?
Northern Ireland always depressed me. I mean, the first time I went there with the Scots Guards, I wasn't even 21. I was 20. And, old Etonian 20-year-old with 30 Glaswegians under my command in Northern Ireland, what could possibly go wrong? But it just depressed me that this whole, it was an awful situation, It was just a horrible business.
Was it a religious war or an economic war?
Sort of colonial more than anything, I think. The religion was obviously a factor, but it wasn't really about the religion. It was about who's in charge,
And you started learning about terrorists and that word and that term.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Because that's the first quote unquote terrorist you saw.
Yeah, well, that was the thing. So, for example, Lurgan, which is where I was, the first tour I did with the Scots Guards, 1973. And it absolutely reminded me of my hometown, Newbury, in Berkshire. Similar size, nice high street, W.H. Smiths, people going about their businesses and their, life. And then suddenly, bang, bombs going off and people being killed. And it just seemed very close to home. It felt like, this is happening at home.
And some of that was happening in England as well, right?
Well, it started to.
Right.
At that time, it hadn't really started, I don't think. But later on, yeah, bombs in London and so on.
And how do you deal with terrorists?
Shooting them is a good place to go if you get the chance. But that's obviously not the only. I think what you have to do is you have to be you have to address terrorism at every possible frequency of the spectrum. So yes, you have to go after them militarily and police-wise, but at the same time, you have to acknowledge the fact that there is a political element to this. They may even be right. The terrorist doing what he's doing is not right, but his cause may have some justice, and you've got to address that. And then you've also got to do all the good things of trying to separate the terrorists from their support base, which is probably a civilian one, and why are the civilians supporting the terrorists? And so I think the correct way to deal with terrorism is, because the one thing a government can do is address terrorism at every point on a very broad spectrum, because that is one thing the terrorists can't do. They don't have the power that a government does. TV adverts, the message in the school, the message in the church, the message in the shops, the message on billboards, and the police work, and the intelligence work, and the special forces work, and the soldiers on the street, so that the whole panoply of life is addressed against terrorism. And that's the way to do it. And it has to be coordinated.
Is that what England did or tried to do?
It's in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Yeah. But many mistakes and many, false starts and false, moves along the way. Not simple. But in Malaya is the great example of where they first got their heads around the need to have a sort of really coordinated and broad spectrum of action. So the police, the army, the local community leaders, that everybody is on the same page all the time.
Okay. Do you think we could learn lessons today from that same philosophy? Are we dealing with terrorists correctly today?
No, I think that those lessons have been learned.
Okay.
And they have been applied. I mean, from what I gather, that is what people have tried to do. But, if somewhere like Afghanistan, you are dealing with something so intractable.
It's almost impossible to change the minds of everyone there.
Yeah, to get the whole message across everywhere, up in the mountains, up in the tribes, and when you're dealing with very extreme. And armies don't solve social problems. You know, British armies were sent to Northern Ireland basically to stop the Protestants from burning the Catholic estates to the ground. You know, great. Well, an army can do that. But if that army stays on the ground, then very quickly it isn't the solution, it's a part of the problem. That will happen. That's not what, you know, armies are not good at that.
And that's the story of kind of what happened there.
But I think it's happened in many places.
Yeah, definitely, with US troops for sure. What was the worst thing that happened in Northern Ireland when you were there?
To me,
Yeah.
Coming onto a bomb scene immediately after it.
Seeing civilians killed, things like
Well,
that.
so scraping them up, yeah.
Wow. And so you spent years up there.
Yeah, I did 5 tours, and I think I worked it out 3 years, actual time.
Actual time there. Okay. I guess you learned a lot.
Yeah, but also at that age, you know, you're at the age when you're learning and growing up anyway.
Right.
Probably not the ideal place to do it, but...
Yeah. I know your mother is South African, but tell me about your relationship with Africa, personally and then militarily, because that's kind of
yeah,
maybe...
no, sure. So we were brought up half South African. Mummy and Daddy met on the boat in Cape Town Harbour. Daddy, the returning victorious England cricket captain, said Mummy didn't stand a chance, I don't think, at that point. He was going to sweep her off her feet. And so we were very, very much brought up, you know, thinking that we were half South African, half English.
Okay.
Which in those days was quite a sort of cool thing to be, you know, it was sort of, say the boys who were half New Zealand, half English, or half Australian, half English, or half Canadian, half English, you know, at school, you always had a little bit of a sort of, you know, swagger.
Okay. At Eton, at least.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, we are, and at prep school.
Okay.
Not least because, you know, lots of those boys were quite good athletes. Not that I was a very good athlete, but, you know, there was a bit of a sort of swagger about it. And then we visited South Africa, you know, to see my grandparents quite often. And
What are your memories of South Africa? How would you describe South Africa to someone who's never been there? What does it feel like?
I don't know. It would depend, I suppose, on where the person I was talking to did come from. So, I mean, Australians find South Africa quite familiar and vice versa. And there's Americans too find South Africa quite, you know, and it's got a highly developed infrastructure. It doesn't feel, you don't feel as if you're in a third world country in South Africa. I mean, you're not, you know, it has it's got big problems at the moment, but, you know, there's a road system, there's a rail system, there's, you know, the airports are thumping great big airports. You know, you don't feel as if you're in a sort of struggling African country. And it's not jungle. It's you know, the high veld, and so it's very open, wide, very beautiful. The Cape's amazing. You know, there's some incredible mountains and the sea, stunningly beautiful.
Yeah, I've been there a few times. It's beautiful. And tell me about the military experience in Africa. How did that start? And then how did it kind of morph into private contracting?
Yeah, that is a strange story. And basically, I rejoined the British Army because of the first Gulf War. And when I worked for General Peter de la Billière, who was our Gulf War general. I was on his personal staff, and when he left, that was the end of my job. I was then offered another job.
I was in 91 to go for. Okay.
Yeah, but this was actually 92 because he stayed on and I stayed on with him. And I was offered a very good job back in the Special Air Service, which was very nice. You know, it was a good job. And at the same time, my very good friend, Tony Buckingham, said, no, you can't do that. He was actually jealous of the job anyway, but he said, you can't do that because it's time you made some proper money. And I'd been working with him a little bit, I'd helped him, and he was setting up a new oil and gas company, a tiny one, with a project in Angola. And I'd been instrumental in helping Tony get into Angola in the first place. And he said, come on, just come and join me. So I did. And that was May 92. And then in Angola, there'd been a whole long story, you know, the huge sort of civil war. The biggest proxy war of the Cold War was carried out in Angola.
The biggest.
The biggest, yep. With Russian and Cuban troops assisting the MPLA, the Luanda-Angola government, and America and the South Africans assisting UNITA, General Savimbi.
And why have that proxy war there? Because of all the oil reserves?
Yeah, I guess so. And, you know, it just became a massive battleground. Tanks, jet fighters, artillery. You know, this wasn't a little bushfire. This was a full-on punch-up.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.